Hello and welcome to What If. Today, what if Seinfeld had a revival? The popular, influential sitcom Seinfeld ran originally from 1989 to 1998 for a total of 9 seasons, and ended with an infamously divisive finale that was seen as grossly underwhelming by the majority of the show's fans. What if there had been a revival of the show for a 10th season? I constructed my own concept list of 10 episodes as a sort of guess of what a Seinfeld revival occurring 5, 10, even 15 years after the original series ended would look like. Most of these ideas were taken from a Twitter account called Modern Seinfeld, which I'll link in the description, though some of the ideas are my own original. Episode 1, The New Contest. In this episode, Jerry, George, Elaine, and Kramer spend the entire episode in a restaurant competing to see who can go the longest without checking their phone during the meal. Episode 2, The Swipe. In this episode, Kramer borrows Jerry's phone after his breaks and begins to answer texts as if he were Jerry. In turn, Jerry borrows his girlfriend's phone and becomes paranoid about her past when it automatically connects to the Wi-Fi at Newman's apartment. Meanwhile, George gets mad when he shows his girlfriend a funny picture on his phone and she begins swiping through his photos. This is the source of the episode's title, and at one point, Jerry and George have an exchange like this. "She swiped, Jerry. You can't swipe." Finally, Elaine's coworker Peggy is disgusted when she finds out Elaine is a toilet texter. Episode 3, The Enigma. In this episode, Kramer gets fed up with the gang's insistence that Bob Sacamano isn't a real person and introduces his friend. I personally pictured Bob as being played either by a handsome businessman type that no one would expect Kramer to befriend, such as John Hamm, or else someone who surpasses Kramer in weirdness, like Jeff Goldblum. In the meantime, Elaine gets mad when Putty invites her over to Netflix and chill, but he actually just wants to watch Netflix. Jerry argues with the woman because he can hear her music even though she is wearing headphones, and George finds out that if you type his name into Google, it suggests George Costanza gay. Episode 4, The Doomsday. I picture this revival season being released in the 2012 to 2013 season of television, which sets this episode near the infamous date of December 21st, 2012. In this episode, Tim Whatley throws an end-of-the-world party that Jerry and Elaine attend. Kramer becomes a doomsday prepper and ropes Bob Sacamano and Newman into helping him. George wants to get baptized just in case the world does end, and just in case God is waiting for him. Episode 5, The Proposal. In this episode, Elaine rejects Putty's Jumbotron proposal because he's wearing giant 2013 glasses. Kramer celebrates New Year's Eve on London time to avoid the crowds. After noticing the battery is almost dead, George struggles to find an outlet to charge his phone while waiting for an important call. Episode 6, The Rent. In this episode, Kramer rents out his apartment every night on Airbnb and lives in the hallway. Jerry and George argue over late-night text etiquette, and an old video of Elaine dancing resurfaces and becomes an internet sensation. Episode 7, The Downgrader. In this episode, Elaine's new boyfriend is a downgrader, meaning that when she calls, he texts, and when she texts, he sends an email, etc. The voice of Kramer's car navigation is so soothing it puts him to sleep. Jerry's girlfriend speaks in anagrams like LOL and TMI. George finds out his father is using medical marijuana. Episode 8, The Password. In this episode, Elaine tries to reconcile with Putty long enough to get his new Netflix password. Kramer's friend Mickey holds a grudge against Game of Thrones because he wasn't cast as Tyrion, the character played by Peter Dinklage. Jerry learns that Crazy Joe Davola recently underwent extensive facial reconstructive surgery and worries that every new face he sees could be Davola. Episode 9, The Grid. Sue Ellen Mischke, now divorced, claims she's pregnant with Jerry's child. Kramer goes off the grid, but he ends up using Jerry's phone and computer. George and Elaine find out Crazy Joe Davola's plastic surgery was done to make him look like Jerry. And Episode 10, The Hotel. In the finale of this revival, the gang takes a vacation in an attempt to escape the mundane routines of their everyday lives. But when Jerry and Kramer get hotel rooms directly across from one another, and the gang spends a lot of their time in Jerry's hotel room or in the diner across the street, they realize nothing has changed. Obviously, these 10 episodes are just the ideas that I think sounded funny, but let's cover some notes about nothing. As I said, most of the ideas for the show were taken from the Modern Seinfeld Twitter account, though the introduction of Bob Sacamano and Crazy Joe Davola's plastic surgery were my own ideas. The premise of the final episode, as well as Frank Costanza's use of medical marijuana in the 7th episode, was something that the writers of Seinfeld apparently considered doing if a 10th season had been picked up back in '98, at least according to my research. I constructed my concept of the revival as a limited series because I thought it would be too difficult to come up with enough ideas for a whole season or more. Many recurring Seinfeld characters were not brought back in an effort to avoid shoehorning in cameos and making it seem as though the revival was attempting to get by solely on nostalgia. I believe the 10th episode, The Hotel, ends on the kind of note that the finale of Season 9 should have if it wanted to avoid controversy. Not only does it keep the character dynamics and settings the same as they always were, albeit with a slight change in scenery, it also ends with the characters accepting that their lives have always been the same and always will be. This is the opposite of the real finale, which was jarringly different than the rest of the show, and thus alienated many of the fans. Finally, it's worth mentioning that I think the Seinfeld reunion episode on Larry David's Curb Your Enthusiasm proved that a real revival of Seinfeld would be impossible, because the core cast members have been out of their characters' shoes for too long. If you watch that episode, the characters just aren't as funny as they are in the actual show. Some of that may have been on purpose, but I have a suspicion that not all of it was. My guess is that Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld may have realized all this for themselves, and done the reunion episode the way they did as a message to the fans, saying, basically, that this would be the best possible route, and that a true reunion of Seinfeld just wasn't and still isn't in the cards.